Welcome to the surprisingly interesting little video about frequency in language, in text and in language teaching. Actually, it's not as little as I'd intended it to be. So let's get started. Here is the definition of frequency in the Collins-Coburn Learner Dictionary. If you pause the video and read these definitions, you'll see that the first one refers to the word's use in general English. The second definition is what frequency means in physics, or acoustics to be more specific. It does not refer to data collection and statistics, which is what frequency in language is all about. In the top right of this slide, we see 4 red dots and an orange one. Coburn is telling the learner that this word is quite frequently used in English. Here are 5 verbs which are all different ways of going, and they all have different numbers of dots. Which word do you think has got 5 dots? In other words, is the most frequent in English? And which do you think is the least frequent? Pause the video and try putting the 5 in order. So, how did you go? Any surprises? You can see that each one is less frequently used than the one before it, at least according to the frequency counts in the Coburn corpus. It is not until C1 that CEFR criteria mentions synonyms of less common words. Many language learners appreciate seeing the frequency of new words when they look them up in dictionaries, as it indicates usefulness. Usefulness? Let's see what an expert has to say about this. Professor Geoffrey Leach was a great expert in such things. He was a professor of English at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom and published widely on many aspects of English, some of which are connected with frequency. So let's start with a couple of quotes from his article. He said, "I claim that it is valuable to build frequency considerations into one's curriculum, one's syllabus, one's teaching materials, and one's classroom teaching. If an item naturally occurs frequently in the language being taught, it is likely to be important also for the target behaviour of the learner. The learner will later often come across that item in reading and listening and will often need to use it in communicating with others. The words that are most frequent in the language that native speakers use are the words that learners will need and should also use. These words turn up everywhere. What we need is a large sample of English spoken and written by native speakers. We have plenty of these actually. They're known as corpora, the plural of corpus, in the title of the professor's article. We put the corpus into a computer and instruct it to start counting. Computers can quite easily generate word lists from corpora, and different corpora produce different lists. In the table on the left, we see the most frequent words in the British National Corpus of spoken English, then the most frequent words in the written corpus, and thirdly, we see the most frequent words in an academic corpus. Inevitably, the most frequent words in any corpus are function words, but function words have different functions in different text types, which is why these 3 lists are different. The same thing goes for the 3 columns of verbs. Languages have a core vocabulary, and as Leach tells us, they vary in their frequencies more than in their makeup. The pie chart here depicts the relative frequencies of parts of speech in English generally. And while be, have and do are certainly vocabulary items, it is in their roles as auxiliary verbs that they play a great role in creating the most essential grammar structures. Corpus software can, for example, count the uses of the verb to be and sort them in order of full verb or auxiliary verb, as a full verb followed by a noun or by an adjective complement, as an auxiliary verb being used for the passive, or auxiliary verb being used to form the continuous. These features and many more can all be compared in different genres, domains and registers, which include spoken and written language. Let's hear from Professor Leach again. Although it is sometimes suggested that spoken and written grammar are different systems, my position is that the grammatical system is largely the same for both, but the differences show up markedly in frequency. Now that more attention is being given to learning the spoken language, it is important to bear in mind that teaching grammar, which has traditionally been based on the written language, needs to be considerably adapted to accommodate the different learning priorities of the spoken language. As we are starting to see, computers can count words in a language, words in a text, the parts of speech, functional phrases, grammatical features used in context, and whatever other metadata is available. What we end up with is a consensus view. That is, what is the most common or typical or standard or normal way that something is. And in statistics, this is known as the mode. These frequency counts provide us with patterns of normal usage, and patterns of normal usage make up the content of grammar books and dictionaries. Patterns of normal usage is what we acquire as language users and what language teachers teach their students. All of these dictionaries and grammars are computer-based. All of their content has been provided by researchers using corpora. As we can see in the images on the right, patterns are visible. This contrasts with rules which are abstract and invisible. We have patterns in words use. Words are used in different ways according to the register, genre, and domain. There are patterns in phrases and grammatical combinations that all add up to patterns of normal usage. But when we deviate from a pattern, it is either an error or we are being creative with the language, as most obviously happens in poetry. In our reading and listening, we're exposed to far more patterns of normal usage than deviations from patterns. In foreign language learning, it often helps to point these patterns of normal usage out and build language skills lessons around them. But nothing is perfect. Computers can process data very quickly, we agree on that. And the results depend on what linguists have been able to ask programmers to ask for. This is sometimes limited by aspects of the language which are difficult for a linguist to specify. The multiple meanings of a word, which we call polysemy, can be determined by computers if they have the necessary instructions to do so. It is not very difficult for a human to know whether the word chip is being used to refer to hot potato chips, crisps, a chip of chocolate in a biscuit, a computer chip, a golf move, investing or gambling. But a computer needs a lot of related data to distinguish these meanings. The use of a word in different parts of speech, referred to as conversion, is easier for computers to process than polysemy. Some word lists do distinguish chip as a noun, chip as a verb, chip as an attribute in compound nouns. And another problem is that corpus suffers from is recognizing the use of a word in a compound unit. Is chocolate in chocolate chip an adjective or a noun? What part of speech is running in running water? If the problem cannot be answered easily by humans, programmers can't write the instructions for the computers. The basic problem is that single words are not units of meaning. Words need to be studied in their patterns of normal usage. For this reason, people need to read and check carefully the lists that corpus software produce if the lists are going to be used for such things as creating teaching material and syllabuses. Okay, so let's study words in their patterns of normal usage. But which words? Not long before the age of the computer, Michael West worked with a team who manually produced a list of the most useful words. The original General Service List was published in 1953 by West. It claimed that a person who knows all 2,000 words on the list and their related family members would understand approximately 90 to 95% of colloquial speech and 80 to 85% of common written texts. This list has been updated by several teams of researchers recently. Such lists are obviously very useful to anyone who is planning a vocabulary syllabus. The important thing to remember is that words need to be learnt as units of meaning, which involves learning them in their patterns of normal usage. When we want to prepare our students to meet the requirements of B1 informal discussion with friends, as we see here on the right, we need to consider what the patterns of normal usage are when people compare and contrast alternatives and what language is used to express an opinion, etc. These involve words in their patterns, some aspects of grammar, and especially functional phrases such as sentence stems. Now, it's not necessary for students to make up their own phrases for these functions. They simply need to learn the appropriate chunks. Teachers can remind students of them in speaking and writing lessons if they have been observing them in the text that they've been using in listening and reading lessons. Grammatical features have been shown to be used in varying proportions in some registers. As Leach said on an earlier slide, language phenomena happen in different proportions in different genres. He was referring to spoken and written English. Now, computers can count this if the text in the corpora have the appropriate metadata. For example, this text was written by an English woman to be read aloud. And here we see some graphs that illustrate these distinctions. This revolutionary little grammar of English compares features of grammar in 4 registers: conversation, fiction, news, and academic writing. It was published in 1999 and motivated Leach's article 2 years later. Actually, it's not so little. Its 1,200 pages are full of graphs and charts and tables, quite unusual for a grammar book. Figure 6.2 here tells us that the simple present is far more widely used in all 4 registers than the progressive or perfect aspect. Figure 6.3 compares the present and the past perfect, where we can see, for example, that the past perfect is used a great deal in fiction and hardly at all, relatively speaking, in conversation. Figure 4.8 shows that the personal pronouns are used far more than demonstrative or reflexive pronouns, and they are all far more used in conversation than in written registers. These are empirically derived patterns of normal usage. When we're teaching aspects and pronouns, we know which types are likely to have the most examples. When we're choosing reading and listening text for our students, we know which features of language our students can be expected to be exposed to. So here are some frequency-related aspects of language. Pause the video and have a look at some of the aspects of language that are counted. Texts are a goldmine not only of information, but of language that can be used for teaching language and about language. The word coverage here refers to how many words you need to know in order to understand most of the text. We'll see this on the next slide. Readability and working out the CEFR level of a text are calculated statistically, as we are about to see. They are calculated using such features as sentence length and word length, and how frequent the words in the text are in the language generally. This is an example of the frequencies in one text. What data computers can generate from a text. Chunk here is a linguistic term that refers to certain types of fixed phrases. But this is not an academic article. It's an article in the New York Times Magazine, and so is written for the general educated reader. In the top table, we see that over 57% of the words in this text are among the most frequent 1,000 words in English, and almost 8% are among the second 1,000 most frequent words in English. We'll see these words on the next slide. And we can see that almost 15% of the words are text-specific. These are the words which are not on the list referred to above, and the text-specific words contain proper nouns and terms and some other less frequent words in English. A reader of this article who is familiar with chunking and other aspects of grammar and vocabulary and linguistics will not encounter many unknown words. The reader who does not know most of the text-specific words will not be able to understand the article. So here are the words in the chunking article that come from the list of 1 to 2,000 most frequent words in English. When considering using a text with low-level students, we can always assume that they know the words from the first 1,000 most frequent words. But which words here would your students know? We saw this chart for the chunking article, which is in CEFR terms a C2 text. It's interesting to compare the statistics of that text with those of an A2 graded reader. The statistics in the top table are quite similar for both texts. Leach told us that features of language appear in different frequencies in spoken and written language. Well, not only. When somebody writes a graded reader, they are given instructions about features of the language which they can and cannot use, and how much of certain features. Simple Wikipedia has a page that describes how to write in simple English, if you would like a look. Readability is the ease with which a reader can understand a written text. Versatext provides 4 statistical measures. These are very useful for anyone choosing material for their students to read. The readability of any text can be scored by combining the data related to aspects of its syntax and vocabulary choices. The same features can be used to give a text a CEFR level, which Versatext also does. In the chunking article, the average number of words per sentence is about 35, and in the graded reader it is just under 10. Here is a well-known and useful resource that tells teachers, curriculum developers, coursebook authors and test writers about words at each level. Each profile helps teachers and educationalists understand what the Common European Framework means for English. It describes what aspects of English are typically learnt at each level. The online tool, English Profile, presents words in their particular senses at different levels. It represents the development of learners' word knowledge. Remember at the beginning of this video that the Coble Dictionary gave the 2 most common meanings of the word frequency, but not the specialist statistics definition that are used in linguistics. For example, this is what it tells us about the word slow. An A1 student will know this simple adjective, meaning not fast. A B2 student will know the phrasal verb to slow up or to slow somebody up. And a C2 student will know to be slow in doing something. Ever wondered how many words a learner should know for each level? Well, you're in luck. The frequencies in this table give the expected vocabulary size for each of the levels. These lists were produced by some researchers in language acquisition. The vocabulary frequency lists already referred to provide lists of words that are necessary for each level. This means that if we were writing a B1 syllabus, a list of the most 3,500 words in English would be a very useful starting point for designing teaching resources. Word clouds are also the product of frequency counts. There are many ways to tailor a Versatext word cloud. One of the most interesting word clouds shows the lemmas according to score that we see here on the right. These are words which occur in the text but are not high-frequency words in English generally. They correspond more closely to the list of text-specific words than word clouds which are based just on frequency in the text itself. Both word clouds can be used to good effect as language teaching materials. Not in the language generally, not in a certain text, but just between our collective ears we associate a word with only a few others in the language. It turns out that the first word we think of when we hear another word is also statistically common amongst many people. The shape of these 3 graphs is completely standard for many thousands of words that this word association database contains. There are 1 or 2 first associations that are common across the population, then there is a number of less common ones, and then many individual ones, outliers in fact. Collocation is also a frequency-based feature of language. You might like to pause the video here and consider these questions. The problem is that there are many definitions of collocation. Most definitions state that a collocation is a frequent co-occurrence of two words in the language generally. The problem with any word that is understood by different people differently is that people can be writing and discussing and analysing and drawing conclusions about different things. Defining terms is essential. As you can see from these examples, the collocations do consist of two words, two content words, and they are in a grammatical relationship, which are also elements of syntax. This means that they are part of forming sentences, and because they are frequent collocations, using them makes the language sound natural, more native speaker-like. If you don't already know Professor Hoey, here he is, Professor of English Language at Liverpool University. In his very famous 2005 book called Lexical Priming, he took one sentence from a book by Bill Bryson and compared the chunks in the sentence with a corpus to find out how typical the author's writing linguistic choices were. On this slide, we see a different sentence from a different book by Bill Bryson, and on the next slide, we see how often the chunks of language are used in a corpus of general English. As a native speaker of English, Bryson used patterns of normal usage without thinking about it. This is what native speakers do everywhere. With Professor Hoey's permission, I call this process the Hoey procedure. It is an interesting task that learners can do. They get to chunk the sentence, they look up each one in a corpus, such as Coca and Skell, and experience the notion of patterns of normal usage for themselves. Where did Bryson get his patterns of normal usage from? Did he hear and read them so often that when he's writing and speaking he uses them without thinking? Yes. Grammar emerges. It emerges over many years of input. Native speakers of any language are full of them. Now it's time to meet Adele Goldberg. She's published extensively in construction grammar and cognitive grammar. She observes that there are certain patterns that revolve around verbs that are acquired by very young children. They are basic aspects of the real world that they hear all the time, quite probably in most languages. Even though these verbs also occur in EFL textbooks, they are taught just as words, not in their grammar patterns. Students could be tasked with suggesting and finding typical someones and somethings for these patterns. This teaches vocabulary and grammar at the same time. Now, language acquisition researchers, including Goldberg, have found that using a particular syntactic pattern primes us, or makes us ready, to use it again. Therefore, giving the students opportunities to use a pattern is helping them consolidate it for future use. Remember that they are used in statements, questions, and commands, and in past, present, future, conditionals, passives, and all the rest. And these can be pre-tasks for writing and speaking activities at all levels. These are just some of the reasons that make exploiting these patterns of normal usage so valuable for students. There are more on the next slide. And now, here are some troponyms of 4 of these general verbs. Every troponym has the same pattern as the superordinate, the verb at the top. This is one way in which our vocabulary expands in both our first and second languages. If we think of deliver, donate, and hand as ways of giving, and know that they all have the same grammar pattern as give, they are easy to add to our active vocabulary. Unfortunately, this linguistic information has not made it into teaching materials. A grammar pattern is a property of a word, and knowing that the same pattern is the property of many words with the same basic semantics is a great shortcut to vocabulary expansion. It not only helps with fluency and accuracy, but with sophistication. We can also help students enrich their vocabularies by adding the subjects and objects of these different verbs, as there is considerable variation in them. As just one quick example, the people who award and the people who are deliver are different, and they award and deliver different things to different people in different roles. These are all patterns of normal usage. So, in closing, let us consider these things. Firstly, all features of language can be counted. Many of these counts reveal patterns of normal usage that make language use native-like. We need to teach and expose students to patterns of normal usage and raise their awareness of this. Frequency is part of students' incidental exposure to language, that is, through reading and listening. There are many language teaching and learning resources and activities that enable and foster this. Welcome to this surprisingly interesting little video about frequency in language, in texts, and in language teaching.